Hi, everyone. Welcome to another online causal inference seminar. Today, we have the pleasure of having Krikamol Muandet from CISPA giving a talk on a measure-theoretic axiomatization of causality. His collaborator, Junhyung, is also in the Q&A, helping answer some questions. So please feel free to ask. Our discussant today will be Ricardo Silva from UCL. We look forward to that as well. And the questions today will be handled by Razi, so I will switch over to her.
Thanks, Emma. So per usual, please submit your questions as soon as you have them in the Q&A. If there are quick clarifying questions, I can interrupt the speaker. Otherwise, Krik would have natural stopping points to take your questions. So without further ado, I pass it to Krik. Please start sharing your screen, Krik.
All right.
Sorry, I need to close my window.
No worries.
Yes. Okay.
Looks good.
Yeah. Okay. So you can see my screen. You can hear me well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. Yes. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me to give the talk in this online causal inference seminar. It's an honor to be giving a talk to an expert audience in causality, of course. And also thanks, special thanks to Ricardo as well for agreeing to be a discussant. I think this is also a lot of work for him, and I think we really appreciate that you make the time to do this. Yeah, so today I'm talking about measure-theoretic axiomatization of causality, which is recently accepted at NeurIPS as an oral presentation. Junhyung, who's actually my colleague at the MPI in Tübingen, actually did most of the hard work in this paper, and he already gave the talk in New Orleans. So he is also here today. So I believe that he would be a better person to talk about this work, but I will try my best to talk about it. But if you have any question, I think Jun will also be happy to answer as well. And this is also joint work with Simon and Bernard, who are both at the MPI in Tübingen. Okay, so let me try. Okay, so this is the outline of the talk, right? And then I think the main focus of this talk will be on causal spaces, right? But let's start with the motivation. I believe we all recognize, I think, the importance of causalities. In public policy and medicine, causality has become a tool that policymakers and scientists use to systematically evaluate the impact of certain policy or drug before implementing them in the real world. In pattern recognition, there's also a growing interest in teaching, computer or machine to not only recognize patterns that are associated with the target that we are interested in, but also the one that have causal relationship with the target, right? With the hope that we could improve the robustness and reliabilities of this system in a safety critical domain. Causality, of course, can also guide consequential decision, especially in criminal justice, employment, and education, where fairness is of utmost importance. And the list go on and on, right? And in most of these applications, there's a consensus that the language of probability theory is insufficient for us to talk about causality, right? So we need something that allow us to talk about causality, which is basically intervention or manipulation, right? And to talk about causality, we need the notion of intervention and manipulation. So what we did in this work basically is to extend a probability space to what we call causal space. by adding a notion of intervention into the probability theory. Let me first introduce a probability space, okay, which basically lie at the heart of probability theory. So a probability space is composed of a sample space, right? That's the first component. This basically is just a set of outcomes, right? A sigma algebra of events. And this is a collection, basically a collection of subset of omega, right? And a probability measure P. And the probability measure P allow us to basically express the uncertainty about the outcome of a random experiment. For example, if we roll a fair dice, then we can say that the probability of observing an event number would be 3/6, which is 0.5, right? In this case. And so the point here is that they have long been debated on what property of probability P should satisfy. This includes also the behavioral justification of P, right, given by definitely. But one of the most universally accepted one is the Kolmogorov axiomatization of these probabilities. So we will basically treat this Kolmogorov axiomatization as a primitive object in this work. Right? And in the language of Kolmogorov axiomatization, usually when we refer to this probability measure, we often refer to it as additive probabilities. So probability theory basically differs to statistic in that it describes the forward direction from data generating process to the data, right? Whereas statistics often involve the backward direction. Can I, for example, infer something about the data generating process from the data, right? And we see a similar distinction between causality and causal inference, right? While causal inference asks if we can infer causal relationship from the data, right? Causality, like probability theory, characterize the mechanism through which the data are generated. And that is, so we will focus on causality in this work. And I think this is something that people in causality is already well known of, is already familiar with, is basically the Pearl ladder of causation. So it's provide a clear basic taxonomy of different questions that an intelligent agent might be able to ask, right? So the ladder of causation consists of 3 rounds, right? So the first round often involves questions that arise from seeing or observing the world, like what does a symptom tell me about a disease, right? The second round, right, of the ladder involve more elaborate questions that basically arise from doing, intervening, or interacting with the world. For example, if I take aspirin, will my headache be cured? This kind of question belong to the second round. Last but not least, the third round, like the most elaborate of all, involve an act of imagining that results in counterfactual question like, was it the aspirin that stopped my headache? Right. And a graphical model is often used to represent different rounds in per ladder of causation, right? So for the first round, we often talk about association, right? And the association can be modeled, for example, in this case, with the association between X and Y can be represented as a undirected edge in the graph, right? And then when we talk about intervention, we can basically model like causal relationship by adding a direction to the arrow, right? And basically, rather than in this work, rather than using graphical model, we treat probability theory as a primitive object for the third rung of the ladder. And our goal is basically then to extend it to the second rung of the ladder. We will not talk about the third rung, right? We will only focus on the second rung of the ladder. And to extend probability theory, right, we need a tool that would allow us to talk about what happened to a system when we intervene on a subsystem. And this is exactly what we want, the concept of manipulation. This is something that is missing from standard probability theory, right? And by adding manipulation or by adding manipulation into probability space, this gives us causal space. So let me now introduce what causal space is. Before going there, let me first introduce some notation. First, we consider a set T, right? And T, we use T to represent an index set, right? It could, for example, represent a finite set of random variables. It could represent a continuous space of time, for example, if you're interested in stochastic processes, right? But we treat it as a general index space, and we denote it power set by P of T, okay? Then we would consider a product measurable space with index T, which can be sort of written in this form, right? So the measurable space that we will consider omega and H will be sort of a product space of some set E and epsilon T, okay? And the primitive object that we will be interested in this talk is H sub S. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but S sub S represent basically a sub sigma algebra of H that correspond to some subset of T. Okay. And the intuition here is that we have a sigma algebra, right? H, right? You can also represent this by S sub T. This represents the entire space, right? And S sub S is basically a subspace of this. Yeah. The second concept that we will be of important is the concept of transition probability kernels. Right? K sub S can be viewed as a map from a subspace, right, indexed by S, omega SS, into the entire space. Okay, and this probability kernels, transition probability kernel, give a measure on the entire space for every value of X. Okay. And the intuition here is basically you can think of it as a conditional distribution, right? It's basically specify how the information flow from the subspace to the entire space. Okay, that's basically the notation. So the idea of causal space is basically just, you know, adding the concept of manipulation or intervention into standard probability space, right? So a causal space is a quadruple, right, that consists of, you know, the first three elements here is a standard probability space. What news here is a set K. So a set K here represents causal mechanism, right? And a causal mechanism is a collection of a causal kernels indexed by a subset S, right? And so K sub S is, we think of it as a causal, well, we call it causal kernels, right? And why we need this causal kernel, this will become clear later. And we define the causal space in this way, such that these two axioms, such that the causal kernels satisfy these two axioms. And I will basically explain this axiom, these two axioms later, but let's take this for granted for the moment, right? And P here, right? The probability measure P here, P here can be thought of as an observational distribution, okay? And then the concept, we think of the concept of the intervention as simply, right? So now we have a causal space. So now causal space capture not only the association, but now also the concept of causal mechanism, right? And then we think of intervention as a process of first, we choose a sub-sigma algebra, right? Corresponding to some subset of index sets T. So let's say U, right? And we represent the sub-sigma algebra here as H sub U, right? And then we place any measure Q on this subsigma algebra. Right? And that essentially corresponding to the intervention, right? And the intuition here is that first we start with a causal space, right? And then we pick a subsigma algebra. And then we think of intervention as pressing a measure Q on this subsigma algebra, and then the effect of the intervention can be thought of as how the information are propagated through the entire space. Okay. And this is basically the new causal space that we would get, right? So after we place Q on the subsigma algebra, we would get sort of a new causal space as a result of the intervention, right? And these two formulations give us how the probability P would look like after the intervention, and also how the causal mechanism would look like after the intervention, right? And I will not go into further details here, but I mean, the intuition here is that, so the primitive object here for us is this subsigma algebra, right? And then by doing an intervention, we just place some probability measure Q on that. And then the resulting probability P and causal mechanism that arise from that intervention is basically determined by both, you know, the measure Q that we place on that subsigma algebra, and also the causal kernels of the original causal space. Okay. So basically the intuition that we have for the axiom that the causal kernel has to satisfy, basically the first axiom just say that if you intervene on an empty set, right? Basically that means that we intervene on nothing, or we don't really do any intervention at all, then we should get the original causal space back, right? So the causal kernel K here just give you just P back if you intervene on an empty set. Okay. The second axiom basically just say that if we place Q, right, as an intervention, then the new causal space should have that Q as a new so the measure P after the intervention should correspond exactly to that Q. Basically say that if you place Q, a measure Q as an intervention, right, then that Q should basically be the result of the intervention. You should get back the probability Q, right? Because I mean, we need this axiom because there exists a situation where you might actually place a measure Q on a subsigma algebra, but then you get something else, right? Because the causal kernel, the transition probability kernel, or what we call causal kernel, is not actually decoupled from the probability measure. So this is something that we need to restrict. Okay, so that's basically the idea of causal space, right? How is it useful to think of, you know, causality this way, right? Instead of thinking of it as I don't know, graphical models or expecting. I mean, it seems like we start, I mean, instead of using like a graphical model, we start from probability theory, probability space, and then extend it, right? And how is it going to be useful, right? And then now let me give some example of how we can actually apply causal space, and how is it going to be useful, especially compared to standard structural causal models. Okay, I hope I'm doing well on time. Feel free to interrupt if I'm running out of time or anything like that. Yeah.
You're great.
Okay.
All good.
Good. Okay. Right. So basically, causal space, the idea of causal space subsume a structural causal model, right? the structural causal model, or SCM, consists of a set of structural equations that govern causal relationship between a finite number of variables, right? And basically, these causal mechanisms often specified by structural equation, and also you need to specify the noise distribution as well. And to compare causal space to SCM, like let's consider basically a popular example of ice cream cell and fatal rip current accident, or I mean, you can think of it like the number of deaths from shark attack. That's those are very well-known example, right? And the following two plots basically show the number of ice cream cells and the number of fatal rip current accident within the same periods, right? And it's clear from this plot that there's a dependency, or at least correlation, between these two variables, right? And the way that we use causal space to capture this association is we take causal space like this, right? And it's basically the measurable space is just a product of E ice and E accident. This represents just a space of the number of ice cream cell and the number of accidents. And you have a product of Lebesgue sigma algebra, and then you have P and K, right? And then in this case, we can actually choose P to be anything that has a strong correlation between the number of ice cream cell and number of accident, right? And here to actually encode the fact that there's no causal relationship between ice cream cell and fatal recurrent accident, we can decide a causal kernel in this way, right? For K ice, that's represent causal mechanism for ice cream cell. This basically for any even A, we just say, okay, K X A is just P of A. And similarly for the number of accident, right? We can just decide the causal kernel in this way, right? And this reflect the fact that there's no causal relationship between the number of ice cream cell and fatal recurrent accident, okay? So this is basically the way that we use causal space to capture association, right? How would we use, for example, SCM or graphical model to represent maybe correlation between these two random variables, right? So what we would have is that, okay, we would start with two random variables, right? So because there's no causal relationship between these two random variables, there would be no direct link between A and I, right? Then how would we model, correlation between these two, right? And the way that we would do this is to essentially introduce the third random variable. This could be a temperature, T, right? Maybe the temperature could influence both the number of ice cream cells and also the number of accidents, because of course people buy more ice cream in the summer, and also people go out and go to the beach more often in summer as well, right? But why stop there? It also depends on the economy, right? The economy, if we have good economy, then this would also, influence the number of ice cream, and also maybe people would take more vacation if it's good economy, right? But again, why stop there, right? We can go on and on, right? We can say, okay, everything in the world could influence the number of ice cream and the number of accidents, right? So the thing is that as soon as we stop, right, we make an assumption that there's nothing else that influence, or is a common cause of these two random variables, right? So in order to basically model correlation between two random variables, it's essential, or it's actually necessary for you to introduce the third variable, right? Whereas by using the causal space, you can directly model this correlation without introducing any kind of restriction or any new information into the causal space. So that's the first sort of the comparison, or at least application of how we can, how causal space could be useful. So the second one is basically crop yield and price, right? And in this case, we are interested in the number of rice, well, the amount of rice yield in million ton and the price per kilogram of rice, for example, in Korean won in this case, right? And this would be our causal space. Let's say we have two random variable, rice and price, right? And this is how the data look like without intervention, right? So we say the higher the rice yield, the lower the price, right? Because that kind of reflect supply and demand, right? Now, in this case, we can essentially say we would put a joint Gaussian distribution as a probability measure, right? And then the government, for example, might decide to, I don't know, maybe increase the amount of rice or fix the amount of rice or buying up the stock of rice, right? Let's say the government want to intervene, right? And then fix the amount of rice to be 3 million tons, right? And we can say that this creates sort of an influence on the price as well, because as the amount of rice increases, the price right decrease. I mean, because that also create incentive for the farmer, right? And this is how the data would look like after the intervention, right? So in this case, the causal kernel that we choose is basically just a Gaussian with mean 4.5, okay? And similarly, the government could also fix the price, right? And this would also result in a different distribution of rice and price. Okay, this is how the distribution would look like. In this case, we would choose the causal kernel to be just a Gaussian distribution with mean equal to 4. Right? And why do I show this example, right? Because typically this is the example that that is kind of problematic to model with using standard structural causal models because of a cyclic relationship, right? So when there's a cyclic relationship, we have a problem with SCM because so the problem is that whenever there's a cyclic relationship in SCM, the existence of observational probability, observational distribution, as well as interventional distribution is no longer guaranteed, right? And even if they exist, the uniqueness of those distributions are also not guaranteed, right? But with causal space, we can naturally represent a situation where there's a cyclic relationship between random variables. We can also use this to model stochastic processes, right? And I think the problem with a standard structural causal model is that you have to assume a finite number of random variable. But in this case, because we rely on an index set T, which could be finite, could be countable, infinite, or even uncountable, right? So we can pick T to be, for example, time, and then that would allow us to model stochastic processes. So I will skip quickly to this, and then
Craig, can I interrupt you very quickly? Yeah, so there's a question by Xinguang Zhao. Can you tell us briefly the advantage of your approach over existing approach based on potential outcomes or graphical diagrams? What kind of new problems can be solved with this approach?
So I think, okay, that's a very good question, right? I think the motivation for us is essentially not to replace existing framework, right? SCM and potential outcome, they're extremely helpful, useful, right? This is reflected by how often they have been used in the past, right? And I think SCM potential outcome has been used, right? And I think they have been used a lot in causal inference, right? And what we focus on in this work is not in causal inference, but in causality, right? In forward direction, in explaining or how to model how the data are generated from a causal mechanism, right? And how, I don't know. I think to be frank, I don't know. I think this is something we also wrote in the paper, is that we don't expect this to be as useful as structural causal model or potential outcome, right? So I think we don't have actually a result that provide a practical way of how to do causal inference from this framework yet. But I think that is something we have to think a bit more on how this could be useful in practice, of course.
Thanks.
I don't know if Jun have something to add to this.
Junhyung, do you have
Hi.
anything to add?
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So yes, as Krikamol said, our motivation wasn't to, for practical, our main motivation wasn't for practical reasons for statistics and machine learning. Our main original motivation came from providing a framework of causality that is rigorously grounded in measure theory in the same spirit as probability theory. Some byproducts came out of it that Krikamol just highlighted through some examples, like being able to represent cycles or being able to represent continuous time stochastic processes, which current frameworks are not able to do. But we view those as more as byproducts, but the main goal was to provide a measure-theoretically rigorous framework. And probability theory in statistics and machine learning without causality, people don't resort to sigma algebras and probability spaces to do statistics and machine learning. Doesn't mean that probability theory has no value, and we kind of view our contribution more in that spirit.
Thank you. Thanks for explaining.
Thank you. Yes.
Appreciate the examples also.
Yes.
All right.
Okay.
Continue.
Okay. So now, okay, let me. Okay, so far I have basically introduced the causal space and provide a few examples of how we can use causal spaces, right? Now let me, I guess, conclude by providing a few points of discussion, especially comparison between causal space and SEM in particular. The causal space differ from the SEM in the way by which the causal information is encoded. Right? In SEM, the causal information is encoded in how the system affects a subsystem through a set of structural equations. Right? On the other hand, the causal information in the causal space is essentially encoded in how a subsystem affects the system through the causal kernel, right? So it's going in the opposite direction. So I will say that this is exactly what we actually interested in, right? In the concept of manipulation, right? Because in the real world, we are interested more in, okay, what happened to the whole system if we intervene on a subsystem, right? So causal space provides basically a direct way to answer this question, right? And it's aligned with what we actually initially wanted. Also, the different lie also in what are the primitive objects, right, that we use in the SEM, right? So in the SEM, we often treat a set of variables, right, x1 to xn as primitive object, as well as noise distribution and also structural equation, right? And then the system is inherently deterministic, right? Observational and interventional distribution are actually derived from these primitive objects. On the other hand, causal space, right? In causal space, we treat probability space and causal kernel as primitive objects. Then the system become actually fundamentally stochastic, and the observational, like P, and the interventional distribution that we obtain via causal kernel are the primitive object, right, in this system, right? So they are not derived from any other primitive object. Right? So in this work, we only look at, how to extend probability space to the second rung, right, of the ladder of causation by adding the notion of manipulation through causal kernels, right? But I think an interesting future direction would be how to use this for counterfactual, right? So that's still unclear. And we have a initial discussion in the paper, but I think we still need to do to work on it to be able to answer how to use a causal space to capture counterfactual. The question of identifiability, transferability, that's also an important part, and abstraction, representation. And what I want to also point out is actually the probability space itself is also, although it's universally accepted, right? There are some people who criticize the original axiom of Kolmogorov, right? And some people say is this axiom of additivity is actually can be relaxed, and this result in, for example, in the field of imprecise probabilities. And the question is, well, how can we model causality from the perspective of imprecise probability would be another interesting direction, you know. So in this case, we start from, you know, precise probability, right? I mean, that's what people in imprecise probability call probability with additive properties. Yes, and there's a few other questions that I think would be interesting to pursue as well. So to summarize, right? So what we did in this work is basically providing axiomatization of causalities, right? That is the forward direction going from causal data generating process to the data, right? And we do this by treating probability space as a primitive object, right? And then adding intervention into it. And this gives us causal spaces. Right? We provide some example of how causal space could provide remedy to maybe some of the most fundamental problems that we encounter, like latent variable, like hidden confounder, cyclic relationship, and continuous time stochastic processes. We have some discussion about potential outcome as well in the paper. So, I mean, if you're interested in the details, so please feel free to check out the paper. It's available on arXiv. And that's bring me to actually the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Greg, for the nice talk. There were several questions, and Junhyung has already answered them, and he's answering some more. So maybe I can just ask them out loud, some of them, to help him. So one question is, does the causal kernel measures how the probability is distributed over all the possible subsets in the sigma algebra?
So can you say that again? Sorry, I missed.
Yeah, so the question is, does the causal kernel, well, one question is causal kernel, is causal kernel just a type of probability measure? And the other question is, does the causal kernel measure measures how the probability is distributed over all the possible subsets in the sigma algebra? So the question is anonymous. Maybe the person can raise their hand and clarify the question.
I don't.
Meanwhile,
so I don't
there
know.
are, yeah.
So I don't know if like the person would like to ask that question directly. So maybe it's clearer to answer.
Yeah, nobody has raised their hand yet, but maybe I can ask the other two questions. So can you say a few words about whether the causal kernel can be thought of as a type of probability measure?
So the causal kernel is essentially the transition probability kernel, right? So it's give you, I mean, you can think of it as a conditional probability, right? Conditional distribution, basically. Right?
But it should be made clear that it's the same kind of object as conditional distributions, conditional probabilities. But when you say conditional probabilities, usually you have a probability space, and those are calculated from the measure that you have in the probability space, whereas these causal kernels are the primitive objects of the space that can differ from the conditional distribution. And obviously, the fact that causal kernels can differ from conditional probabilities is the main distinction of causal theory from probability theory.
Thanks. And there's a general question of whether you can speak up to the underlying assumptions in your approach. Yeah, the question is very high level. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
What are the underlying? So what are the underlying assumptions in this approach? Okay, there are actually many underlying assumptions, if I understand correctly.
Well,
so typically, I guess, like in a different approach, we might assume that the system is acyclic or something like that. You don't seem to have those types of systems. Is there anything?
Shall I?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So actually, we place very, very few assumptions on the underlying. Yeah, there are very, very few assumptions on the underlying space. So we just assume that it's in the form of a product, the probability or the measurable space. But otherwise, we don't assume acyclicity. Yeah.
And
but
in terms of
the assumption is also encoded in the axiom, the two axiom that we introduced, right? That could be thought of as basically the fundamental assumption.
I guess, yeah.
Can I just ask a follow-up? In terms of the interventions, you are focusing on these hard interventions or the do interventions? You're not focusing on the other types, or is that?
So in this talk, we focused on. So when you say hard interventions, do you mean setting values to variables or giving distribution? Oh, so in this talk, we Krikamol focused on the intervention where we put a measure on a subset of the space. So that would be kind of stochastic intervention. In the paper, the intervention is in the most general form where we can pick a subset of the variables to intervene on and then actually put some causal relationships between them as well. So like draw some arrows within the variables that you choose to intervene on.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I guess I missed some parts in the talk.
That was not in the talk.
Okay, so it's very general.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, I think maybe we should now move on to the official discussion from Ricardo. Thank you for answering all these questions. There've been so many. Ricardo, so quick, if you could stop sharing your screen, and Ricardo, you can please start.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much. Let's see if this works on this. I'm using an iPad, so sometimes strange side effects happen with it. Oh, sorry, I'm not sure what's happened here. Just 1 second. I'm trying to hide a corner of the page. Okay, can you see it well?
Yes.
Great. So thank you very much for inviting me for this discussion. Thank you, Krikamol, for the talk. I just have a few comments on how to link what was presented to other things I know of. Maybe there is some synergy there to be exploited. So it's very good to go back to foundations. It's very good to see yet another way by which you understand that probability by itself is not enough to describe what causal modeling amounts to. It's also very nice to come back to something which is very general, just the very basics on how the different constructions can take place. But it's also interesting to try to see how we could bring this more to practice, which kind of continual possibilities you have there between these very basic foundations and other tools that people are more used to. So of course, when you create axioms, what you really want, of course, is separate what is primitive from what is an implication. You want our implications to be coherent, so you can draw conclusions from some starting set of assumptions. And when we talk about causal modeling, we talk a lot about invariances, right? So if you intervene in some part of the system, some part of it doesn't change. So there's some degree of predictability of what will happen, even if you haven't done a particular intervention yet. So you can also of course, like in the rise yield and the price, describe every single scenario where intervention takes place extensively. But ideally, what we like to do is if we allow for some subset of the scenarios to be able to deduce all the scenarios they're interested in without having to specify them extensively. And the paper has some directions explaining how to situate this in the broader picture. So when we talk about cyclic relationships, it's not that it's derived from some sort of dynamical system. It's really taking an abstract direction here. But if you try to model assumptions about the world, this may feel like throwing too much away. Even if it's a nice pragmatic thing to think that you don't need to be attached to a particular constructive way of understanding what cyclic model is. I think the paper is a very humble note on these assumptions, of course, that you need in practice may be better captured by other frameworks, but I think there's a lot with this provided here that can show a link on how these other frameworks can be generalized. I'm just going to sum a couple of examples here, and maybe Krikamol can build on that, explain which kind of links they see there. Because he mentioned graphical models, and of course, graphical models is just it's kind of a user interface for something more abstract, right? Independence models. You have some notions of invariances is what things don't change condition on something else. We can stitch them together in some sort of language that allows us to specify just a few of a small subset of these conditional independencies and then derive everything else. You can see there's even a Markov chain, right? If you're a Markov chain, any subset between two endpoints will create, and no empty subset between two endpoints will create an independence, but you don't need to explicitly enumerate them. If you think about graphical models, you have something like a local Markov condition. You just have to specify the condition distribution, one time point, given the previous one, then everything follows from that. So it'd be good to see in which sense causal spaces could afford this more constructive procedure, providing a kind of a seed set of invariances, and from that derive a broader picture. If you think about condition dependencies, we know out there that there are different formulations of it. One that I like in particular from people like Phil David, where they try to make things very general in the sense of reducing everything to notions of independence between random variables and intervention variables. Because then you do have a leeway into measure theory and specifying how different measures emerge by stitching together measures induced from particular values taken by these intervention variables. So Constantino and David, for example, had a paper not long ago in the Annals of Stats on describing exactly this type of system where you have intervention values like the ones represented by squares in my diagram there, which basically encompass invariances that need to coherently put together in a joint measure. And this is done by specifying these conditional independencies. The graphical model itself just follows from that. You have something like statements like this. There's some primitive, which is this intervention fx, and primitive, which is intervention fy. They're related to random variables x and y by these conditional independencies that you see there. And they kind of have semantics like the future does not cause the past. It's like saying if we have a variable in the future here, we have a particular intervention on it, x and that will be marginally independent. So this is one way of more fundamentally describe what you mean by the future doesn't cause the past. And these marginal independencies are very naturally captured by a directed model. So the directed model is not the primitive view, it's the fact that you need to specify these marginal independencies that brings you to think about DAGs, because other models of independence don't naturally catch easily how to represent these marginal independencies. So it'd be interesting to see, since Krikamol presents a very general formulation that works nicely in continuous time, for example, to what extent these two could be combined. Was one thing that is not evident to me is even if you go to this route of explicitly describing intervention variables, sometimes you may think about uncountable number of these interventions, right? Like you see in control theory, that when you hold a particular part of the system fixed, you're holding it over time. So it's like you have a process on the intervention variables themselves. It's not clear to me how would you fundamentally express this uncountable number of intervention variables. There's something that causal spaces could help with. And finally, there's this brief discussion that Krikamol added about what it means to take into consideration parents in a graphical model when you have continuous time representations and you can have infinite dimension stochastic processes feeding each other. Of course, an SCM can represent a kind of a subset of this process, and it can be coherent in itself, but it doesn't mean how to relate it to the bigger picture, right? How it be embedded in an infinite dimensional process. But there are other formulations like that, which may not be necessarily causal. There are other formulations of independence models. In situations like that, you may have independencies among stochastic processes. There's, for example, work by Vanessa Dideles a few years back on concepts like local independence, where you have multivariate point processes. And what you have there is the filtrations in these processes are not necessarily relying the whole history, right? You can rely on a subset of them. So there's this subsetting of what is used in the past in the forward stochastic processes that replaces this notion of parents when you have this continuous time formulation. I would be interested to see how causal spaces could be actually linked to that and provide some new perspectives on how do you formulate things like these notions of local independence from a more fundamental point of view. But they're quite different bag or different things that I just find interesting and a little of. It'd be good to hear your thoughts, Krikamol, and other people in the audience too. Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ricardo. Yeah, so you're welcome to discuss, Krik and Junhyung.
Yes, so maybe I can start. I think I agree with the point that Ricardo raised. I think the main question that I also have is also that I think different framework or different model of causality that we have seen, right, in the past operate at different level of granularities. Right? Maybe the concept of causal space is very general, right? But then SCM operate at a different level of granularity. And then the question is whether this framework will be useful. It depends also on which situation are we in, right? And maybe different situation will require different level of granularities, right? And then in that case, I think then for me, the key question is, what is the right level of granularity that would allow us to talk about, still make sense to talk about the concept of causality, and then at the same time allow us to do reasoning, right, from the data or inference from the data, right? And I think SCM has proven to be very useful in that respect, right? Provide at least the right level of granularity, but there's still something missing, right? I think people have tried to fine-tune SCM a bit as well toward maybe more, I don't know. I mean, extending the SCM to something that become more abstract or more general than the model has been proposed in the past.
Junhyung, do you have any comments you'd like to add on the discussion as well?
Well, just first like to say a very big thank you for Ricardo for putting the time to go through the paper. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I think just one thing that I wanted to say about the last slide about the parents and direct causes and continuous time stochastic processes. We actually view that as, and Krikamol mentioned this in the talk as well, we view this as one of the main differences between our framework and SCMs, in that we don't model causality relying explicitly on the parents or the direct causes. So the way causality is formulated in the SCM framework, you have the structural equations F, and they take in the parents as the arguments. And as Ricardo pointed out, this is problematic in, for example, in continuous time stochastic processes, where each time point doesn't have a parent because you always have other time points in between. And our formulation is more that it looks at not how the parents affect a variable, but how each of the variables or each subset of the variables affect the rest of the system. Yeah. So that then naturally also leads on to the consideration of causality in continuous time stochastic processes as well.
Okay. There seems to be someone who has raised their hand to ask a question. I guess we have time. Do you guys feel like answering another question? Okay. Let's see. Matan, you're welcome to ask your question. You should be able to unmute yourself. Maybe they changed their mind. Okay. All right. Well, I mean, I just wanted to say, I guess, I wanted to say, like, thank you for the nice talk. It's a very interesting kind of line of work, I think, very interesting paper. And I very much agree with Ricardo in that, like, we have all these frameworks for describing various things in causality, and they all have their uses, but we don't have any sort of single framework that is better than the others in a, universally in a sense for understanding certain things. So I think you're adding like a different aspect of understanding that is deep in like this measure theoretic way. It's very welcome for various researchers who are focused on that type of work. So just wanted to say thank you. And I think the amount of questions we got just point to the people being interested in understanding this. So very nice work. All right, I guess I'll wrap things up. Great.
Yeah, I would like to also
Okay.
thanks everyone involved in this, and thanks for inviting. Thanks Ricardo, and also thank Jun for helping with the answer as well.
Yeah, I also thanks Ricardo. Ricardo, very nice discussion. Very cool. All right, great. So just in order to wrap up, we hope to see you all next week. Next week, we have a talk by Kosuke Mai from Harvard University on the CRAM method for efficient simultaneous learning and evaluation. So looking forward to seeing you all there. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.